Imagine waking up tomorrow to the news that an army from over 2,000 years ago had somehow materialized on a modern battlefield. No drones, no satellites, no guided missiles. Just iron, flesh, discipline, and a terrifying kind of genius that modern warfare has never truly replicated. Most people would laugh. Military experts would shake their heads. And then the battle would begin, and everything we thought we knew about war would shatter into pieces. Because here is the truth that historians debate behind closed doors, and that military strategists quietly acknowledge in their research papers. Some of the armies that walked this earth thousands of years ago possessed qualities so extraordinary, so devastatingly effective, that even with today's technology advantage, facing them would not be the easy victory most people imagine. This is the story of 10 ancient armies that could make modern militaries rethink everything. Stay with us, because by the time we get to number 1, you will never look at ancient history the same way again.
Number 10. The Assyrian Army. Long before Rome, long before Alexander, there was Assyria, and the world had never seen anything like it. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire built what historians now recognize as the first true professional standing army in recorded history. This was not a collection of farmers handed spears during planting season. This was a dedicated, year-round fighting machine that answered only to the king, trained constantly, and was funded by one of the ancient world's wealthiest empires. The Assyrian army was the first to organize itself around specialized units: iron-equipped infantry, mounted archers, heavy cavalry, and most devastatingly, an elite corps of engineers who could build siege ramps, tunnels, and battering rams of terrifying efficiency. They introduced iron weapons into large-scale warfare at a time when most opponents were still clinging to bronze, and that metallurgical advantage alone was equivalent to the gap between a musket and a modern rifle. Their campaign stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, and they held the largest empire the world had ever seen.
What makes the Assyrians particularly haunting when viewed through a modern lens is their psychological warfare doctrine. They were among the earliest armies to understand that destroying an enemy's will to fight was more efficient than destroying the enemy itself. They kept meticulous records of their conquests, not out of vanity, but as a strategic communication tool. Every inscription, every relief carved into palace walls showing captives, burning cities, and impaled enemies was propaganda designed to reach the next kingdom before the army did. In the modern era, we call this information warfare. The Assyrians invented it. Their siege technology was so advanced that cities that had resisted invaders for centuries fell to Assyrian engineers within weeks. If you placed an Assyrian army today in any historical conflict before the age of firearms, they would win every single time. And even against a modern force, the sheer organizational genius and adaptability of their command structure would make them a far more dangerous opponent than anyone wants to admit.
Number 9. The Persian Immortals. There are armies that fight wars, and then there are armies that change the concept of what an army can be. The Immortals of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the elite corps of Xerxes and Darius, were the latter. Their name alone tells you everything about the psychological strategy behind their creation. The Persian High Command maintained a force of exactly 10,000 men at all times. Every soldier who fell in combat, who became sick, or who aged out was immediately replaced, so that to any observer, the unit appeared to never lose a single man. It never shrank, it never weakened. It was, to every enemy watching, immortal. That is not just a cool name. That is a deliberate psychological operation built into the army's very structure. And it is the kind of strategic thinking that modern special forces units study to this day. The Immortals were divided into 2 distinct wings of 5,000 each. The first 5,000 were the Royal Guard, equipped with the finest weapons Persia's vast wealth could provide: gold-decorated spears, intricate armor, and a standard of personal equipment that no conscript force of the ancient world could match. The second 5,000 were the frontline shock troops, trained to an almost Spartan standard of physical endurance, but with the additional advantage of the most sophisticated logistical supply chain the ancient world had ever constructed. The Persian Empire moved its armies with a level of logistical coordination that would not be rivaled for over 1,000 years. Supply routes, forward depots, rapid communication between commanders, these were not modern inventions. They were Persian innovations, and at the heart of that machine were the Immortals, a self-renewing, psychologically invincible, supremely equipped force that bent the known world to Persia's will for nearly 2 centuries.
Number 8. The Spartan Army. If you have ever wondered why Sparta still captures the imagination of soldiers, filmmakers, and military historians over 2,500 years after its peak, the answer is simple. No society in human history ever built a more complete warrior from the ground up. From the moment a Spartan male child passed the initial inspection by the city's elders, a process that literally began at birth, every single day of his life was structured around one purpose: to be the most dangerous human being on the battlefield that it was possible to create. The agoge, Sparta's legendary training system, began at age 7. Children were taken from their families, placed in competitive barracks groups, deliberately underfed to teach them to forage and endure, exposed to harsh weather without adequate clothing, and subjected to physical and psychological pressure that would break most modern adults within days. By the time a Spartan soldier reached the battlefield in his prime, he had spent over 2 decades being forged into something that was less a person and more a weapon with a heartbeat. What made the Spartan army truly terrifying beyond its individual soldiers was its collective psychology. In battle, a Spartan phalanx did not just present a wall of shields and spears, it presented a wall of men who had no fear of death, not as a motivational slogan, but as a deeply conditioned reality. During the Persian Wars, 500 Spartan soldiers alongside 3,000 allied Greek troops held off a Persian force estimated at well over 100,000 men at the pass of Thermopylae for 3 days. They did not hold because they had better weapons. They held because they were psychologically and physically incapable of breaking. Modern military science understands that in combat, the side that maintains cohesion under extreme stress wins. The Spartans had solved that problem more completely than any army before or since. A modern soldier, no matter how well trained, faces years of preparation. A Spartan soldier faced a lifetime of it. That difference is not academic. On a battlefield, it is everything.
Number 7. The Macedonian Army of Alexander the Great. Here's a question that military historians have debated for decades. Was there any army in human history that was more perfectly designed to win? Alexander the Great inherited a fighting force from his father, Philip II, that was already revolutionary, and then spent his reign turning it into something that had no precedent and arguably no equal. The Macedonian army was the first in history to consistently and successfully employ combined arms warfare, the coordinated use of multiple specialized units working together as a single integrated system. The companion cavalry, arguably the finest heavy cavalry force the ancient world produced, worked in direct coordination with the Macedonian phalanx, whose sarissa pikes extended to a length of up to 6.5 meters, creating an impenetrable wall of overlapping spear tips from which there was no conventional escape. Supporting both were specialized light infantry, archers, siege engineers, and a logistical network that allowed the army to operate thousands of kilometers from home for years at a time.
What is genuinely extraordinary about Alexander's army is not just what it did, but how it adapted. Every campaign it fought was in different terrain, against different enemies, using different tactics. Against the Persian cavalry on the plains of Gaugamela, Alexander used speed and the concentrated hammer blow of the companion cavalry to shatter the center. Against the Indian war elephants at the Hydaspes River, a weapon that had destroyed lesser armies, the Macedonians adapted their formations in real time to neutralize the threat. Against fortified cities, they deployed siege equipment that was the most advanced of its era. This army crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and entirely different climate zones and kept winning. In military terms, adaptability is the ultimate force multiplier. An army that can defeat every kind of opponent it encounters is not just powerful, it is something close to unstoppable. Alexander's army went undefeated for over a decade across 3 continents. That record has never been matched. Number 6. The Roman Legion. If the Macedonian army was the most perfectly designed fighting machine of its era, the Roman Legion was the most perfectly sustained one. The Roman army did not just win battles, it won centuries. At its peak, the Roman military system maintained professional legions numbering around 5,000 heavily armed soldiers each, stationed across an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Every single one of those soldiers had served for a minimum of 25 years, trained continuously, and operated within a command and logistics structure so sophisticated that military schools still analyze it today. The Roman army built roads, not for aesthetic reasons, but because a road that moved a legion faster than an enemy could respond was a strategic weapon. The engineers embedded in every Roman force could construct a fortified camp in a single afternoon, a bridge across a major river in days, and siege engines capable of reducing city walls to rubble in weeks.
What truly sets the Roman legion apart when examined through a modern military lens is its institutional resilience. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, widely regarded as one of the greatest military minds in history, handed Rome 3 catastrophic battlefield defeats at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, and Rome did not collapse. It adapted. It raised new legions. It changed its tactics. It refused at an institutional level to accept defeat. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal surrounded and destroyed a Roman force of nearly 70,000 men in what remains one of the most tactically complete victories in military history. Any other state in the ancient world would have sued for peace. Rome kept fighting. 17 years later, Rome defeated Carthage and burned it to the ground. That combination of tactical sophistication, engineering capability, logistical mastery, and institutional stubbornness is not something you overcome with firepower alone. It is a military culture, and military culture, more than any weapon, determines who wins long wars.
Number 5. The Han Dynasty Army. Most Western audiences know the armies of Rome, Greece, and Persia. Far fewer know that on the other side of the world, at almost exactly the same time, a military force was operating at a level of technological and organizational sophistication that in several critical areas surpassed anything in the Western world. The Han Dynasty Army of China, which reached its peak between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD, was in many ways a Roman legion's equal, and in specific technologies, its superior. The Han military was the first to deploy the crossbow as a primary military weapon at massive scale. Chinese crossbows of the Han period were capable of accurate fire at ranges that no contemporary Western bow could match, and they were produced and deployed in numbers that gave Han armies a ranged firepower advantage that would not be replicated in the West for over 1,000 years. Han commanders also pioneered cavalry tactics that integrated mounted archers with heavy infantry in ways that proved devastatingly effective against the nomadic warriors of the steppes, opponents whose speed and mobility had defeated every other settled civilization that faced them.
What makes the Han Army particularly compelling to modern military analysts is its command and control structure. The Han military operated with a formalized system of communication, chain of command, and battlefield signaling that bears more resemblance to modern military organization than most people realize. Commanders at different levels had clearly defined authority and responsibility. Strategic decisions were separated from tactical ones. Intelligence gathering was systematic, not opportunistic. And the logistical system that supplied Han armies on campaigns thousands of kilometers from the capital was sophisticated enough to sustain operations for extended periods in terrain that would have ground most other ancient armies to a halt. Historians who have studied both the Han and Roman militaries note that if the two had ever met at their respective peaks, it would have been the most evenly matched conflict in ancient history. That conversation alone tells you everything you need to know about where the Han army stands in the hierarchy of ancient military power. Number 4. The Viking Raiders. When people think of the Vikings, they often picture large men with horned helmets swinging axes on beaches. Set aside the helmets, those were largely a later invention, and replace that image with something far more accurate and far more terrifying. A force of supremely athletic, psychologically fearless, tactically flexible fighters who had mastered the one military technology that no other force of their era could counter: the longship. The Viking longship was not just a boat, it was a strategic revolution. Shallow enough to navigate rivers that larger vessels could not enter, fast enough to outrun pursuit on open water, and light enough to be physically carried overland between waterways. The longship gave Viking forces a mobility advantage that made every coastline and river system in the known world vulnerable. There was no defensive perimeter. There was no safe interior. Every city near water, which in medieval Europe meant virtually every city of any significance, was potentially a target that could be reached in hours with no warning.
The individual Viking warrior, beyond the technological advantage of the longship, was a fighting man of exceptional physical quality. Viking society organized itself around martial culture from childhood. Sword, axe, and shield work were not hobbies or skills acquired during military service. They were the primary cultural activities of Norse male society from adolescence onward. Viking warriors trained constantly because their social status, their livelihood, and their survival depended on it. They also possessed something that professional armies sometimes lack: genuine personal ferocity. The Norse concept of the berserker, a warrior who entered a state of combat that rendered him seemingly immune to pain and fear, was not mythology. It was a documented psychological state, possibly enhanced by certain plants, that produced fighters whose aggression was essentially unmanageable in close combat. Put a force of 500 Viking warriors with longships against any medieval defensive position near water, and military historians will tell you quietly that the defenders had a very serious problem. The fact that Viking forces raided and settled from North America to the Russian river systems tells you that these were not exaggerated legends. They were the most mobile fighting force of the early medieval world. Number 3. The Aztec warriors. The armies of Mesoamerica are among the least understood and most underestimated military forces in history. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, they encountered a society that had developed a military tradition spanning centuries, operating on entirely different philosophical and strategic principles than anything European warfare had produced. The Aztec warrior culture was built on a concept that European military thinking had largely abandoned: the supremacy of individual combat skill. Every Aztec warrior was ranked by the number of enemy soldiers he had captured alive in battle, because the Aztec military tradition valued the taking of captives for religious purposes above the taking of enemy lives. This created an army of men who were trained to defeat opponents in close personal combat under conditions of maximum stress, which, it turns out, is exactly what effective hand-to-hand fighting requires. The Aztec military also developed armor and weapons specifically adapted to their environment and opponents. Ishkawipili, a thick cotton armor soaked in salt water and dried, proved so effective at stopping obsidian-edged weapons that Spanish conquistadors abandoned their metal breastplates in favor of it during the campaigns in Mesoamerica. The macuahuitl, a flat wooden club edged with volcanic obsidian blades, was capable of decapitating a horse with a single strike, a fact that horrified Spanish soldiers who had assumed their mounted cavalry would be invincible. The Aztec military system at its peak could field armies of tens of thousands of warriors who were individually among the most skilled close combat fighters on Earth, supported by sophisticated logistics, supply networks, and a command structure that coordinated multi-pronged campaigns across varied terrain. The conquistadors did not defeat the Aztec Empire through military superiority alone. They did it through the devastating introduction of diseases to which the Aztec population had no immunity, combined with large-scale alliances with peoples who resented Aztec rule. Strip those factors away, and the military encounter looks very different indeed.
Number 2. The Mongol Army. Of all the armies on this list, the Mongol military stands alone in one specific and haunting category: scale of documented achievement. Starting from a base of fewer than 1 million people on the Central Asian steppe, the Mongol military under Genghis Khan and his successors conquered and subjugated most of Eurasia within a single century. They defeated the Chinese Jin dynasty, the Khwarezmian Empire, the armies of Kievan Rus, the Polish and Hungarian kingdoms, the Abbasid Caliphate, and came within a campaign season of reaching the Atlantic coast of Europe. No military force in history, before or since, has achieved territorial conquest at that scale, at that speed, against that diversity of opponents. And they did it not through numbers. The Mongol armies were almost always significantly outnumbered, but through a combination of strategic genius, tactical innovation, and psychological warfare so sophisticated that military analysts still study it today. The Mongol army operated on principles that sound less like medieval warfare and more like modern special operations doctrine. Their intelligence network, built on spies, traitors, and informants who preceded the army by months or even years, gave Mongol commanders detailed knowledge of enemy dispositions, political tensions, and supply vulnerabilities before a single arrow was fired. Their communication system, using relay riders who could pass information across hundreds of kilometers in a single day, gave them a command and control speed that no opponent could match. Their tactical use of feigned retreat, deliberately withdrawing to draw an enemy out of a defensive position and into an ambush, was executed with such consistent precision that even commanders who knew it was coming could not resist taking the bait. And their psychological operations were the most sophisticated the ancient world had produced. Entire cities surrendered without a fight because the Mongol reputation for total destruction of those who resisted had traveled ahead of them like a wave. Fear, deliberately manufactured and systematically spread, was as much a part of the Mongol arsenal as arrows and cavalry. In a world of modern communications, that same psychological strategy, applied through different channels, would still be devastatingly effective.
The Spartan sacred band's spiritual heirs, the army that combined everything. But before we reveal who truly takes the top spot on this list, we need to ask the question that makes this entire conversation matter. What would it actually take for an ancient army to destroy a modern military? Not just compete, not just inflict casualties, but actually win. The answer requires thinking beyond weapons technology. Any ancient army placed on a modern battlefield facing tanks, aircraft, and precision-guided munitions would lose that specific engagement. That is not the question. The question historians and military strategists are actually asking is this: if you placed an ancient military system, its doctrine, its training philosophy, its command structure, its psychological preparation, its adaptability, into a modern force, what would it produce? And that question has a clear answer. It would produce something terrifyingly effective.
The army that earns the top position on this list is the Mongol military at its absolute peak. Not because of any single battle, but because of what it represents as a complete military system. The Mongols combined every element that defines military excellence: intelligence gathering that rivaled modern reconnaissance, psychological operations that collapsed enemy resistance before combat began, logistics that sustained operations across impossible distances, tactical flexibility that defeated every type of opponent it faced, and a command culture that rewarded merit over lineage and adapted faster than any enemy could counter. Modern military doctrine, the doctrine taught at West Point, at Sandhurst, at military academies across the world, incorporates principles that trace directly back to what the Mongols were doing in the 13th century. Speed of maneuver, disruption of enemy command and control, exploitation of psychological vulnerability, concentration of force at decisive points. These aren't modern inventions, they are Mongol innovations.
The reason the Mongol army takes the top position is simple and sobering. They won wars the way modern militaries win wars, with the tools of their time. They did not just defeat enemies, they made entire civilizations disappear into the pages of history. The Khwarezmian Empire, which stretched across modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, was one of the most powerful states on Earth in 1218. By 1221, it was gone, not defeated, gone. The speed, completeness, and psychological devastation of that campaign has no parallel in modern military history. And the mind behind it, Genghis Khan, was a man who had never attended a military academy, who had no access to the military literature of Greece or Rome, who built his doctrine from observation, experience, and a terrifying clarity of strategic thought. That is what makes these ancient armies so unsettling when examined honestly. They did not have less. In the ways that matter most, in doctrine, in psychology, in adaptability, in the will to win, some of them had more.
So the next time someone tells you that ancient armies were primitive compared to modern military forces, ask them one question. If the technology disappeared tomorrow, if the satellites went dark and the drones fell from the sky, and it came down to trained human beings making decisions under pressure, which army would you want standing behind you? The answer, if you have been paying attention, might surprise you. And that surprise is the whole point. Because history is not a story of how far we have come. It is a story of how much we have forgotten. And some of what we have forgotten was genuinely terrifying.